Yeah, Nate can make coffee.
Little cardamom, little cinnamon. Sorry, no falafel today, guys. I tried to make it happen, but we'll talk about it a little bit. It's really not going to change your religious walk. But we'll talk a little bit about the Pharisees, and I'll be quick, and we'll hand this back over to Mom. But when I was over in Israel, it was probably 8 years ago. I remember being at the Garden Tomb, and I had no interest in history at that time, little understanding of the Bible. I remember at the gift shop there was a big book of Josephus. So I can't remember which one. There's lots. And I remember looking at it. I'm like, I should go read this. And it started a journey. I wanted to understand my faith more, and I wanted to know more about the Bible. And if you're going to Israel, your New Testament is one of your best resources, because you can see where Jesus went in the Gospels, and you just look up the names. And one thing we run into is these Pharisee guys, right? He has a lot of arguments with the Pharisees, so helping us understand the Pharisees can give you some context. Unfortunately, you kind of need to know a lot of the intertestamental period to really build up the Pharisees and who they were and where they came from, because last we checked in, Israel wasn't keeping the Torah very well. And then we have these guys that are zealously keeping it. In fact, they added all these extra laws that we know as the oral law we run into in the New Testament. And eventually that became written as the Talmud about 500 years later. And that's pretty much what Judaism today is actually developed from the Pharisees. So they still exist in thought, at least. So covering that history on your own might be good. Grab some antiquities of the Jews. Wars of the Jews, also very good. There's some extra biblical books as well, like the Maccabees, that we have a quote from here, that can help fill in that time period, right? We got Matthew, we got Malachi to Matthew, we got one page in there that says New Testament, but there's a good 200, 300 years of history that we kind of miss out on the world scale too. We got Julius Caesar, you got Mark Antony, you got Cleopatra, you got Herod the Great, you got the Hasmoneans, and all of a sudden we're just in the New Testament. And then even focusing on Judea itself, you miss out a lot too. That's why you're in this class. Bobby's filled in a lot of information for you. So this is a little quote from the Talmud here. I thought it was very interesting regarding Jesus. So we got Rabbi Alexandri says, Rabbi Yehoshua, and Yehoshua is probably what Jesus' name was. It's Yeshua was the short, and Yehoshua would have been Joshua. Raised a contradiction between two depictions of the coming of the Messiah. It is written, there came with the clouds of heaven one like unto a son of man, and there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. That's from Daniel. And it is written, behold, your king will come to you. He is just and victorious, lowly and riding upon a donkey, and upon a colt, the foal of a donkey. That's from Zechariah. Rabbi Alexander explains, if the Jewish people merit redemption, the Messiah will come in a miraculous manner with the clouds of heaven, which we see in Revelation, right? He comes riding on a white horse with a sword. He's coming, it's a conquering king. If they do not merit redemption, the Messiah will come lowly and riding upon a donkey, which is what we see exactly in the New Testament, right? He came. And in the ancient world, riding on a donkey was not so much lowly, but it was a sign of good favor. Like if we saw a conquering king coming on a donkey, you know that he was ready to make terms with you. He wasn't there just to draw the sword and reap desolation, which we see in Revelation. He's coming to destroy and judge the nations because they deserve it, right? It's been 6,000 years of trouble, so it's interesting. Pharisees, and we'll talk about a little bit about the Sanhedrin too, because that's another concept we run into in the New Testament. We don't really understand what it is, what it means. So here's a little breakdown. What is the Torah, right? We talk about the Talmud and the Torah. So you have the Torah or the Pentateuch would be the same thing. It's the first 5 books. It's given at Mount Sinai. There's probably some sort of, because how did Noah know the difference between an unclean and clean animal when they're on the ark? Right? They had 7 pairs of clean animals and then 2 pairs of the unclean. And then we have, in the New Testament, referred to as the oral law. And we have the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Talmud. They're all pretty much the same thing, right? Mishnah, Gemara was created to make the Talmud. And not written down, right? It's the oral law in the New Testament that was written down about the 5th century. And it's pretty much commentary on the Torah. A bunch of the Jewish sages, just throughout time, just their thoughts on how to observe. And we even see that with the law of Christ, right? Christ gives over 1,000 instructions in the gospel. Somebody counted them, I didn't count them.
Yeah, right.
And most of them are just commentary on the Torah, or corrections to the Pharisees' mistaken interpretations. And it's interesting, as most Christians, just naturally, if you keep the 10 Commandments, you're keeping about 80% of the Torah already, and that's likely more than most of the Jewish Christians. So you're more Torah observant than a Jew. because they focus on the letter of the law, but it wasn't always that way. We'll talk about some Pharisees that were spirit of the law focused, just like Jesus was. So, we hear some harsh words from Jesus. One of them was, and I thought it was, like falafel. It's falafel on the outside. It kind of looks like a nice chicken nugget, maybe. And you cut it open, it's green. It's kind of like the Pharisees, right? So they're whitewashed tombs that are filled with dead men's bones. Is one of the things he said about them, right? They wash the outside of the cup, but not the inside. So he's got some harsh things to say at them. But imagine if the Messiah came to your congregation, he probably wouldn't be as buddy-buddy as you think he might be. He probably would have some corrections for, if you walked into Joel Osteen's church, you might let him know a thing or two, right? Pharisees, what does it mean? In the Hebrew, it's Parsha. Every week, every Sabbath, Jews will study the Parsha. They separate out the Torah, so they study. And that's where that word comes from, Pharisees. It means set apart ones, which we're called to be, right? As Christians, we're called to be set apart from the world. They were specifically being set apart from the world, but also the Sadducees. They want to be, we talked about this with the bread, the challah, right? They were doing the challah as temple worship. They were trying to be set apart from the temple because the Sadducees controlled the high priesthood for so long. And that's where you need some of that history with the Hasmoneans that'll help you out there. And the kingdom of priests being set apart, we have that in not just in the New Testament, right? In Peter and Revelation, we're called to be priests, but in Exodus and also I mentioned Maccabees. The idea of a priesthood, we're all called to be a priesthood. That's why they would wear the zizio, the blue strand. The blue is royal or purple. It was to remind you that you were one of the. It was actually a priestly garment. This is what they call shatnez. You're not supposed to mix linen and wool, but because it's a priestly garment. But we're all priests if you're part of God's kingdom, so you can wear that. So we have that in the New Testament as well. And the Pharisees embraced this doctrine. That's why they did temple worship in their homes. And the Essenes did it to a point. You'll hear about the Essenes because that's where we get to Qumran. You'll probably go to the Qumran site. That's where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And it's thought, according to Josephus, because he points to that area, that's where we get that. Pliny the Elder also points to that area being where the Essenes were. So we have them to thank, but Essenes were probably radical, extra radical Pharisees. They had lots of books too. But that's another rabbit trail. Good. Here's some good verses on the Pharisees not being so terrible. And here's one where they actually warn Jesus that Herod's come to get them. Then later we can contrast that, just to be fair, in Mark 6, other Pharisees are conspiring with the Herodians against Jesus. So it's like, at one point they're warning him, like, Herod's trying to kill you, you better get out. And then they're working with them. And that's possible because there's two different houses of Pharisees at this point that we know of. We had Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. We like Hillel. Hillel is the very spirit of the law. He probably was still alive. He lived to be 120, according to the Talmud, just as old as Moses. So he would have been alive when Jesus was at Passover when he was a boy. And you remember he stayed at the temple. He was talking to the teachers of the law there, and Hillel would have been there. He would have been one of the great teachers of the law. So it's possible they had a little exchange when he was a young boy. It's interesting. We'll talk about Hillel in a second here. Just some other verses. I'm just going to skip on through these, but just to show you that there are some verses. I like this one a lot. We'll go through this one. So one of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked of him, of all the commandments, what is the most important? So the most important one, Jesus answered, is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. It's part of the Shema. Yeah? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these.
Leviticus 19:18.
Well said, teacher. The man replied, you are right in saying that God is one and there is no other but him. To love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. When Jesus saw that he had answered wisely, he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. And from then on, no one dared ask him any more questions. So this is a very similar answer that a convert to Hillel asked him a question. He's like, can you explain the Torah while you stand on one foot? And he was working on his posture. And he actually went to Shammai first, and Shammai said, get out of here, I'm not going to answer that. But Hillel said, what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor, right? It's essentially, the golden rule right here: love your neighbor as yourself. Just some more Pharisees being fair. A lot of them dined with Jesus and were even peaceable. When Jesus was being a little rude, he was trying to poke them, trying to get them to think. They probably would have seen him as a Hillel Pharisee. They would have seen him as a brother. And for a while, Jesus had a lot of converts. It wasn't just the 12. And when he started getting into saying that he was going to destroy the temple and he was the Son of God, and they started, maybe we should back off this a little bit. For a while, he was sounding a lot like a Hillel Pharisee. So that's why he gathered lots and lots of followers initially. And here we just said this, where you stand on one foot, golden rule, should be from Hillel. This is a cultural context note from a Bible I like, the NRSV. Doesn't pick sides, it just looks at cultural context and history and just tries to give you some better understanding of everything. So there's a lot of these nice notes here. And it shows the contrast between these two schools as well, that it still exists today, the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. And that's kind of why we have Pharisees butting heads with Jesus, but also Pharisees kind of getting along, and like Nicodemus, Pharisee, Joseph of Arimathea, Pharisee, probably both on the Sanhedrin as well. Speaking of the Sanhedrin, it would have been part of the temple complex. See the Holy of Holies there. Actually, I keep forgetting of this fancy laser pointer. And the women's court, and then it would have been over here along the wall. So there was 71 members, known as the sages, and this was all commanded in the Torah. This was something, there were supposed to be judges, and there was the greater Sanhedrin, which would pretty much meet daily at the temple, but then there'd be lesser Sanhedrins. There'd be 23 judges throughout the rest of Judea, so they could try different cases. And it would be, well, how did the Sanhedrin mess up with Jesus' trial? Because, you'd only have 71 members during 3 times of the year. We talked about this last week, or 2 weeks ago. What for the 3 times that all 71 members would be at the Sanhedrin? Would be at Jerusalem. For the pilgrim feast days, right? That's when they would all be there. So that's when they would really try the bad cases, like people that they were going to give capital punishment to, like Jesus. But if you read the gospel account, they never go to this. It's called the chamber of hewn stone, or the hall of hewn stone. They never go there. They go to the house of Caiaphas. So it's already shady, right? They don't bring him to this chamber. I'll give another picture of the inside. Yeah, it would look like this. They would have brought him here. They didn't, especially to try him. Of course, they couldn't do capital punishment. They had to go through the Romans anyways, but they still would have judged him here. Mm-hmm. So they do it in the middle of the night, or they take him from the Garden of Gethsemane. Mm-hmm. They bring him to, Garden of Gethsemane is not far from the temple. Why are they going to the house of Caiaphas? Why are they doing this? There was probably Sanhedrin members there, but there probably wasn't all 71, and they would have voted on this. And I'm assuming a lot of the Hillel Pharisees would have voted not to have him killed. So I don't think it was a failing so much of the Sanhedrin, but of just wicked, corrupt high priests like Caiaphas and the Sadducees. And the Sanhedrin changes a lot too. There was almost like a Republican, Democratic thing. The Pharisees and the Sadducees would have been different political parties almost. So sometimes there's a high majority of Pharisees in the Sanhedrin, and sometimes it'd be more Sadducee based. Right after Alexander Jannaeus, who's a fun character, is kicked out, the Pharisees retake the Sanhedrin through one of the regent queens. We have 2 regent queens. You probably didn't know that there was 2 queens of Israel that actually controlled the whole of Judea, and one was Alexander Salome, and her brother was Simon ben Shetta. I think we're talking about him now, yeah. I can't read it, it's what it's saying. But he brought the Pharisee majority back to the Sanhedrin during that time, where Alexander, her husband, had murdered many of the Pharisees. There was a big civil war between the two. Actually crucified 800 of them and had murdered their families in front of them while they were on the crosses. That's what we're talking about. Sadducees, Pharisees, did not always get along. And this is 100 years before Christ. So it would flip-flop. Gamaliel, this is not the Gamaliel that trained Paul, but a Gamaliel that I believe Paul was brought in front of. But he was said to be, one of the last great sages. And he in the gospel, not in the Acts, he says, I can't remember exactly what he says, but it's to the point that we shouldn't judge Paul because maybe he's right. Essentially, he's a Pharisee admitting that maybe there was a Messiah, and just to be careful, we shouldn't judge him. I can't get the exact quote, but I kind of slapped this together. There's another instruction for the Sanhedrin. I think it's the last slide I got. I'm not going to get into Herod. I wanted to just end it there. But any questions on that? Just a little whet your palate for Pharisees and maybe looking at your New Testament a little differently. Maybe break out a little Josephus and make my mom happy. But digging the history, check out the Judean Civil War and learn a little bit more about the Pharisees. All right?
Thank you.
All right.
Can you hook me back up?